Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
I heard this amazing story at my great-uncle's memorial service today. He passed away at 97 and someone shared this gem from his work life that had everyone chuckling despite the somber occasion. My great-uncle was quite a character. He started working at this confectionery factory right after World War II ended. A quiet, dedicated man who took immense pride in his work, he spent over 50 years there, mostly as a boiler room attendant. He was the kind of person who knew every bolt, pipe, and gauge in that facility like the back of his hand. The boiler room was the heart of the factory. Everything ran on steam back then. The machines, the heating, you name it. These weren't your typical water heaters. They were massive industrial beasts that could level half the building if something went wrong. That's why the law required someone to monitor them 24/7, even when the factory was closed. The boilers took so long to heat up that it was actually cheaper to keep them running through the night than to restart them each morning. For 10 years, everything ran smoothly under my great-uncle's watch. Then the company hired this new leading hand who would also act as the safety officer. Fresh out of the army where he'd been a sergeant, this guy walked around like he still had stripes on his shoulder. The production manager introduced the new safety officer, explaining that he'd been hired to update their procedures. My great-uncle simply responded that he was happy to comply as long as the safety officer understood the boiler room requirements. The safety officer started implementing new rules left and right. Some made sense, others seemed like they were just there to show who was boss. Then came the day of the first fire drill. When the safety officer came to explain the drill, he was adamant that everyone must evacuate immediately when they heard the alarm, with no exceptions. My great-uncle tried to explain about the boiler room situation, but the safety officer cut him off rudely, asking if he had stuttered. He demanded that my great-uncle treat this as a real fire, calling it an order. When my great-uncle tried to explain about the boilers again, the safety officer just repeated that there were no exceptions and asked if he was clear. My great-uncle simply replied that he understood perfectly. The day of the fire drill came, and when that alarm rang, my great-uncle did exactly what he was ordered to do. He followed emergency shutdown procedures, cut the gas, vented the steam, purged the water, and walked out to join everyone else. At the evacuation point, it didn't take long for chaos to unfold. The production manager spotted my great-uncle and demanded to know why he wasn't at his post. My great-uncle explained that he was following orders, as a safety officer had told him to treat it like a real fire, so he had performed an emergency shutdown. The production manager was shocked and asked him to confirm what he'd done. My great-uncle repeated that he'd done a complete shutdown, explaining that he had to make sure everything was safe, just like in a real fire. When the production manager asked about the restart time, my great-uncle laid out the whole process. They'd need to fill the boilers, heat them up, and inspect every pipe and joint for damage from the emergency purge. He estimated it would take about 12 hours minimum, plus they'd need the whole boiler team for safety checks. The production manager looked like he'd seen a ghost. They had to call in the entire boiler team on double overtime to work through the night. The factory lost a full day of production, and all the production staff got sent home with full pay since it wasn't their fault. The safety officer tried to protest, saying it was unacceptable, but the production manager cut him off. He told the safety officer that he should have listened when my great-uncle tried to explain, and that this entire shutdown was his fault. He asked if the safety officer understood how much this was going to cost them. The safety officer kept his job, but he was never the same after that. His army sergeant attitude disappeared pretty quick, and suddenly he was very interested in listening to the employees' input about safety procedures. The company also made it official policy that boiler room staff were exempt from fire drills. When my great-uncle finished his shift that day, I heard he had the biggest smile on his face. He never said it out loud, but everyone knew he'd taught that safety officer a lesson he'd never forget. 4 years ago, I was in a terrible car accident that left me paralyzed from the waist down. It was tough adjusting to my new life, but my husband has been my rock through it all. He's always there when I need him, whether it's helping me with daily tasks or just being my strength when things get overwhelming. Last week, we had an appointment at a medical center on the third floor for my regular checkup. Everything went fine until we were leaving. The elevator was out of order. Just our luck. My husband and I looked at each other knowing what we had to do. This wasn't the first time we'd dealt with something like this, and we had our routine down. My husband positioned himself carefully, scooped me up from my wheelchair, and started carrying me down the stairs, while a kind stranger we met in the hallway offered to bring my wheelchair down. We were managing just fine until we reached the second-floor landing, where this middle-aged woman was coming up the stairs. The moment she saw us, her face twisted like she'd just bitten into a lemon. She stopped dead in her tracks and started waving her arms frantically. She immediately started yelling at us, demanding to know what we thought we were doing, and saying this was a medical building, not some honeymoon resort. My husband and I were so shocked, we just froze there for a moment. I could barely manage to ask her what she meant. She then started screaming about how this was completely inappropriate, especially with children around, and that this was a public place. I looked around, and sure enough, there were a few teenagers sitting in the waiting area near the stairs, looking confused at the commotion. My husband tried to explain that he was just helping his wife down the stairs, but she wouldn't hear it. She scoffed and sarcastically asked if that's what we were calling it, then declared this was indecent exposure and that she was calling the police right now. She actually pulled out her phone and started dialing, all while continuing her rant. She kept telling us we should be ashamed of ourselves, talking about how in her day couples kept their private business at home, and calling the whole thing disgraceful. At this point, I'd had enough. I explained to her that the elevator was broken and that I was paralyzed from the waist down. I told her my husband was carrying me because I literally couldn't walk down the stairs, and asked her what exactly she thought we should do instead. The teenagers who had been watching everything suddenly burst out laughing. One of them was clutching his sides, barely able to breathe, trying to get words out about what she had thought and what the reality was. Another teen shouted out that the Karen had just gotten served. The woman's face turned bright red, but instead of apologizing, she completely lost it. She stormed over to the teenagers and actually grabbed one of them by the shirt collar, screaming at them about disrespecting their elders and threatening to teach them some manners. Everything happened so fast after that. The teen's friends immediately jumped up to defend him, while a security guard who heard the commotion came running. One of the medical staff who had witnessed everything had already called the police. The woman kept screaming about youth these days and public indecency, while the security guard tried to calm her down. When the police arrived a few minutes later, they were greeted by quite a scene. A red-faced woman still yelling, a group of teenagers filming everything on their phones, my husband holding me on the stairs, and about a dozen witnesses all eager to tell them what happened. The police took statements from everyone, and when they reviewed the security footage, they arrested the woman for assault on a minor. As she was being led away in handcuffs, she was still trying to justify her actions. She kept whining about how we had been inappropriate and how the teenagers had disrespected her, demanding to speak to whoever was in charge. The police officer simply told her she was in no position to make demands and led her away. The teenager she grabbed was okay, just shaken up. His friends showed us the video they took. The medical center staff was incredibly apologetic about the elevator being out of order, but honestly, the woman's epic meltdown and arrest made it worth it. One of the teenagers posted the video online and it went viral. The woman became known as the Stairway Karen in our local community. I heard she was ordered to take anger management classes and do community service, specifically working with disabled people's organizations. I've been working at Second Chance's thrift store for about 3 years now. After graduating with my art degree and realizing that gallery jobs were harder to come by than I'd hoped, I needed something to pay the bills while I built up my portfolio. What started as a temporary solution turned into something I genuinely enjoyed. There's something satisfying about helping people find treasures in others' cast-offs. And most of our regulars are sweethearts who understand the value of second-hand shopping. Most of them, that is. Not all. I was working the register during what had been a pretty smooth afternoon shift. The store wasn't busy, which was typical for a Tuesday. I'd just finished arranging a display of vintage costume jewelry when a customer approached my register with a cart full of items. She was dressed in what I'd guess were fancy clothes, which always struck me as odd for thrift store shoppers, but I'd learned not to judge. Some of our wealthiest customers were the most dedicated bargain hunters. I started scanning her items, a mix of home decor, some barely used kitchen appliances, and what looked like brand new clothing with tags still attached. I greeted her politely and asked if she had found everything okay. She just nodded, continuing to tap away on her phone while I scanned. I continued processing the items, carefully placing them in bags and making sure nothing fragile would get crushed. When I finished, I turned the display toward her and told her the total was $127.84. She finally looked up from her phone, her expression immediately souring. She insisted that the total couldn't be right, accusing me of scanning something twice. She claimed she had been keeping track and the amount was way too much. I tried to assure her that everything was scanned correctly, offering to review the receipt with her. But she wasn't having it. She demanded that I count every single item and compare it to what was in the computer, insisting that I had clearly made a mistake. I looked behind her. Thankfully, there wasn't a line forming. Fine, if she wanted a show, I'd give her one. I told her I would void the transaction and count everything together. I made sure to be extra methodical, removing each item from the bags and placing them on the counter with deliberate care. I started a new pile, scanning items one by one. With each item, I announced what it was and its number in the count. The vintage vase as item 1, the brass candlestick as item 2, the designer brand blouse as item 3, and so on. I continued this way, watching her face grow increasingly impatient. About halfway through, I picked up a ceramic serving bowl that had been nested inside another. When I separated them, I realized I hadn't scanned it in the first transaction. With my brightest customer service smile, I announced that she had been right about there being a mistake, though not the one she thought. I explained that I had actually missed scanning the serving bowl, and told her that her new total with this additional item would be $142.84. Apologizing for the oversight, her face went through several interesting color changes, first red, then slightly purple, before settling on an uncomfortable shade of pink. She'd been so confident about being overcharged that this turn of events left her completely flustered. She stammered, still trying to insist that she had been sure I'd scanned something twice. I cheerfully told her that thanks to her attention to detail, we'd found an item I'd missed. I expressed my appreciation for her having me double-check, explaining that we always want to make sure customers pay the correct amount, whether more or less than initially quoted. She stood there for a moment, mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Several other customers who'd lined up during our counting session were poorly hiding their amusement. Finally, she quietly told me to just run her card. I processed her payment with the same cheerful efficiency I'd shown throughout the encounter. As I handed her the bags, I couldn't resist one final touch, thanking her profusely for shopping with us and praising her careful attention to detail that helped ensure everything was properly accounted for. I even expressed hope that we'd see her again soon. She practically snatched her bags and power-walked out of the store. The next customer in line stepped forward, grinning and commenting that it was the most polite revenge they'd ever witnessed. I just gave an innocent smile and said, I just wanted to make sure all our customers get exactly what they pay for. She became something of a legend among our staff, and we now have a running joke about bold-checking difficult customers. Even better, she still shops at our store occasionally, but now she's surprisingly pleasant and never questions our scanning accuracy. I've been dealing with chronic migraines since I was 12. It started after a bad fall during a soccer match where I hit my head pretty hard. The doctors initially thought it would be temporary, but here I am, 5 years later, still battling these episodes that feel like someone's drilling through my skull. Most of my teachers have been understanding about my condition. They know I'm a good student despite my frequent absences. I maintain decent grades, turn in all my assignments, even if sometimes I need extra time, and try my best to catch up whenever I miss classes. But my math teacher, she's a different story entirely. From day one, she made it clear that mathematics was, in her words, the foundation of all scientific thinking and crucial for any successful future. Look, I get it. Math is important. But when you're 17 and sometimes can't even open your eyes because the pain is so intense, trigonometry doesn't exactly feel like a priority. I've had to visit the emergency room multiple times this semester alone. The pain gets so bad that regular painkillers don't help anymore. Sometimes I spend days in my darkened bedroom fighting waves of nausea and trying not to move because every tiny motion feels like an earthquake in my head. My math teacher would always make these little passive-aggressive comments whenever I returned to class after an absence. She would sarcastically comment about how I finally decided to join the class, or make snide remarks about how nice it must be to take so many days off. I usually just ignored her remarks. My parents had already provided the school with all my medical documentation, and the principal was aware of my situation. But last Thursday, she finally crossed the line. I was about 45 minutes late because I had a follow-up appointment with my neurologist. As I walked into the classroom trying to be as quiet as possible to not disturb the lesson, she suddenly stopped writing on the whiteboard. In an unnecessarily loud voice, she complained about how ridiculous the situation was becoming and declared that I couldn't keep missing class every time I had what she called a tiny head pain, insisting that everyone gets headaches. The whole class went silent. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, and honestly, I was done with her attitude. 5 years of chronic pain, countless hospital visits, missed events, and lost opportunities, and she had the nerve to dismiss it as tiny head pain. So I asked her if she had brain damage too. The silence in the room became even heavier. Her face went through about 5 different shades of red before settling on a peculiar purple color. A few students gasped, and I heard someone trying to suppress a laugh. When she managed to sputter out a demand for me to explain myself, I told her that since she seemed to know so much about my condition, I assumed she must have the same diagnosis. I described it as the one documented by multiple neurologists that causes permanent changes to brain structure, the one that makes me spend nights in the emergency room. She opened and closed her mouth a few times, looking like a fish out of water. Instead of waiting for her response, I just walked to my desk and sat down. The next day, I got called into the principal's office. Apparently, my math teacher had filed a complaint about my disrespectful behavior. But when the principal reviewed the situation and noted that the teacher had essentially mocked a documented medical condition in front of the entire class, the conversation took a different turn. When the principal asked me to confirm if she had publicly dismissed my medical condition, I explained that this wasn't even the first time she had made comments about my absences. To my surprise, my math teacher was required to attend sensitivity training on dealing with students with chronic health conditions. She was also instructed to issue a formal apology to me and my parents. The principal even arranged for me to have additional tutoring sessions to help catch up on any missed work with a different math teacher. These days, my math teacher barely makes eye contact with me. She handles my extension requests through email now, and all her previous snide comments have completely stopped. I still get migraines, and I still sometimes need to miss class. But at least now I can focus on managing my condition without dealing with unnecessary drama from someone who should have known better. Some of my classmates later told me that other students with various health issues had similar experiences with her but were too afraid to speak up. After my incident, she became notably more considerate of everyone's medical accommodations. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.